today. Today's session will focus on the NEM reform implementation roadmap. And this is a roadmap for anyone who might not be aware that has been compiled by AEMO in partnership with the Reform Delivery Committee to kind of provide AEMO and stakeholders with that holistic view of the reforms impacting Australia. So we will discuss that at today's session. We might jump on to the next slide, Anitra. So before getting into this session, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture, and pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging. I'm on Gadigal land at the moment, the people of the Eora Nation, and it is wonderful sunny Sydney weather, which is a change to what we've had recently. Next slide, please, Anitra. So as covered in the previous session by Lance, it's a two-part series that we've got, two-part session that we've got today. The objectives of the roadmap briefing are really about providing that overview of the implementation roadmap. Hopefully at this session we can facilitate any clarification that people might have on the roadmap and walk through some of the material changes, if you are familiar with the roadmap, that have been made since the previous release in December. Next slide, please, Anitra. So in today's, looking at today's agenda, we've welcome to those who've just joined the call. Lance will walk you through the background and context of the NEM reform implementation roadmap. We will cover off some of the process and changes since the version 3.1 release, so the last version of the roadmap. We will also cover off the informed go live process. This is a process that has been somewhat of an innovation in the NEM reform program. So how AEMO works to provide industry and market bodies with our initial views on our implementation approach and what that impact looks like for participants and AEMO. Lance will also walk you through the roadmap, the NEM reform implementation roadmap, and then hopefully we've got some time for Q&A at this session. Next slide, please, Anitra. So, as with the previous session, and just for visibility for those who may not have been at the previous session, if you can just make sure, we've got quite a few on the call, if you can make sure that you mute your microphone. We will be encouraging participants to put questions in the chat as a priority. So if you really have a question, chuck it in the chat. We've got a number of AEMO SMEs on the call who will work to try and get a response to that question. If we don't manage to get that covered in this session, please do reach out and we will be more than happy to address any questions or queries. So I think in addition, the session will be recorded and we certainly encourage anyone who's not comfortable with that to step off and encourage participants to be respectful, which I don't think we'll have an issue with, and constructive on this call. Lance, I will hand over to you so we can dive into the detail. Thanks all.
Perfect. Thanks, Dave. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back for those who are at our first session today. We thought best just to start the session off with a little bit of background and context for those who aren't familiar with the roadmap. So the roadmap itself was initially established in 2020 during the COVID-19 pandemic to help prioritise the energy market reform program. And this was really just a recognition of the growing regulatory implementation burden on both AEMO and industry at the time, as well as a really clear appetite among stakeholders to understand what is the broader reform agenda and what are the priorities moving forward. Since then, it's evolved and it continues to evolve over time, particularly as we've seen the reform space kind of ramp up. A really good example of this was the release of the Energy Security Board's final recommendations to energy ministers. So here the roadmap evolved to be a more integrated roadmap. It's playing a role in planning the reform agenda, as well as creating opportunities to optimise the implementation of reforms moving forward. And so when we think about optimisation, we're thinking about ways that we could potentially sequence or bundle the changes that are required, hopefully minimising the implementation costs across the industry. Another example of this type of evolution has been the inclusion of gas reforms impacting the markets on the East Coast. So we've included these to support those stakeholders or participants with interest in both electricity and gas, to better understand the full reform agenda that's impacting upon their business and their operations more broadly. So if we think about it, the idea behind the roadmap is really about providing transparency for stakeholders. That could be participants, it could be market bodies, it could be governments, about what is that holistic reform agenda facing the industry and what are the requirements from an implementation perspective to deliver against that agenda moving forward. When we think about implementation, certainly at AEMO, we're really focused on those significant IT system or business process changes that do arise out of the various rule changes or policy reforms that we do see come through. So what we're hoping with in providing transparency, we're hoping that we can implement those reforms both in a timely and an efficient manner, and potentially more importantly, with an idea to reduce or remove costs associated with their implementation, with those implementation activities wherever possible. So pleased to say that we've got version 4 of the roadmap and the supporting artifacts published in late April on the 30th. And this is really consistent with our general practices whereby we update the roadmap at a minimum twice annually, and looked at those April and October timeframes. It's important to call out that, and Dave mentioned it earlier, that we do this in conjunction with the Reform Delivery Committee. For those that aren't familiar with who the RDC is, it basically brings together a strategic group of representatives from across the energy sector, and that helps facilitate a more collaborative approach to planning and optimizing the implementation of reform initiatives and change more broadly. And I'll speak to how we work with that group in due course. If we just jump to the next slide, please. Thank you. For those on the last session, this slide will certainly be familiar to you. It looks to summarize what initiatives make up the program and certainly how they relate to those ESB reform pathways. I certainly don't want to dwell long on this slide, other than to note, as you can see, there's a lot. We heard in our last session that we've delivered a substantial amount of reforms in the last 12 to 18 months. That being said, there's still a lot to go, and it feels like more and more that comes through every month as new rules or policies are considered. So this is also something that we are mindful of. Next slide, please. And next one. So just in terms of how we go about keeping the roadmap up to date, I mentioned earlier that we do this in conjunction with the Reform Delivery Committee. So we actually kicked off this work back in February of this year. It's actually done in accordance with one of our governance arrangements established for the program and the roadmap, specifically our change management process. For those who have received the pack, that's actually provided in Appendix B if you'd like to have a look at that in more detail. By working with the RDC, we're able to explore and not only identify key changes that have occurred since the last update of the roadmap, but more importantly, discuss key issues arising from such changes. A really good example of that is implementation or delivery congestion and how best we can potentially resolve some of those issues. So for example, and I mentioned this earlier, are there opportunities to say bundle the implementation of initiatives, or should we be appropriately sequencing when one initiative goes ahead of another, for example? And so the idea there being we're driving efficiencies, but more importantly, de-risking the delivery of those initiatives moving forward. So as you can see, there's been a number of steps that have reached us here today, including keeping up to date various forums and committees under the program, including the PCF, who we do look to work with as well. Next slide, please. So in terms of the roadmap, I mentioned the roadmap has evolved over time, and in publication of version 4, that certainly continues to be the case. For those familiar with the roadmap, we had previously separated out the ESB post-2025 reforms from all other electricity-related reforms. But in reality, it's certainly one program, and we internally don't think of it as separate streams. For that reason, this time around, we've actually combined those two groups into one, and we are really hopeful that this can assist those who utilize the roadmap to gain a better understanding of the full pipeline of electricity reform initiatives moving forward. In addition to that, quite major restructure, we have made various incremental and material changes, some of which I will cover off in the coming slides. For when we think about an incremental change, this could be something as simple as a name change, and we do see that quite a lot, more than what you probably anticipate. And so those changes don't necessarily impact the overall delivery of an initiative or the program as a whole. When we refer to a material change, and this is certainly where we like to spend a lot of our time, we're referring to a bigger change in, say, the scope of the initiative from what had initially been assumed, or a change in the timeline of, say, 2 months or more. And so those changes can have obviously quite substantial impacts on implementation and delivery timelines, and contribute to things like congestion that I mentioned earlier. Other updates for this time around when it comes to the roadmap, we've done a general restructure of initiatives to be consistent with their committed or estimated go live dates. So bringing anything up to the top that is likely to go live in the next 12 months or so. Finally, we've included a number of new initiatives, such as new rule changes that have commenced since our last publication, as well as removed those initiatives for which we have delivered or implemented to date. I've said this in a few of the forums, and certainly in a few of our internal updates. It's amazing how much has changed. You kind of question how much could change in only a couple of months, and it's always a lot. So this time around, as Dave mentioned, we published version 3.1 of the roadmap in just December. That being said, we've actually made changes to 33 of the 39 electricity initiatives as they feature on the roadmap. And 3 of the 10 gas reform initiatives. And so those changes are reflective of timeline changes or scope changes more broadly moving forward. If we just jump to the next slide, thanks. So I mentioned earlier that the material changes is certainly where we like to spend our time to understand and assess the potential impacts from those changes. What this slide does is provide us with a really good snapshot of some of the material changes that were identified through that, through the process. I will cover off on some of these individually on the coming slides, but I think it's probably important just to draw out a few key themes in terms of the key drivers of change that we had identified this time around. So the first big one, I think, is we saw a number of the AMC's rules consultation processes reaching major milestones, be it reaching a final or draft determination. So this was certainly the case for several initiatives, including enhancing reserve information, improving security frameworks, and unlocking CER benefits through flexible trading. Theme, and I'll touch on those in a little bit more detail in the next slide. Theme 2 is around AEMO concluding its own consultation around the business case for some of its foundational and strategic initiatives. Specifically here, I'm referring to Identity and Access Management, or IDAM, Industry Data Exchange, or IDX, and Portal Consolidation. And we heard from Andrew Bell in our last session on the status of those initiatives and their next steps, specifically that these will progress through AEMO's internal governance and investment process in the coming weeks for approval before commencement and further stakeholder engagement. Finally, the third thing that I certainly draw out is just a recognition that many of the initiatives remain subject to ongoing policy processes or market reviews. For example, at the November 2023 Energy Ministers meeting, we saw Energy Ministers agree to progress some of the transmission access reform work through further design work to be led by the AEMC. So the AEMC have since commenced their transmission access reform market review, building on the work of the ESB, which we're looking at congestion relief markets and priority access models. So while this work continues to progress, we've simply reflected that in the roadmap, pushing out the timeframes to align to the AEMC's review timeframes. At that same meeting of Energy Ministers, they also agreed to develop what is referred to as the National CER Roadmap. They're looking to consider implementing a national approach to technical regulatory standards for CER, as well as establish an expert task force to deliver priorities under the CER Roadmap. So as a result of that announcement, we've agreed with the RDC that following publication of the National Roadmap, we'll undertake a holistic review of all DER or CER initiatives as they feature on the roadmap, and certainly look to revise or amend accordingly to ensure that it's a true reflection of the current reform agenda, particularly in that space moving forward. For now, the simple solution there is we've pushed out the timing for those initiatives that do feature on the roadmap, but do anticipate quite broader changes as part of the next iteration of the roadmap moving forward. I'll just jump into the next slide, please. Perfect, thank you. So in our last session, we took time to run through the initiatives themselves in detail in relation to what they are, the objective scope, and so I don't intend to cover off that again here. Instead, what I will cover off just quickly is what is the key change that was identified and what is the next steps associated with that. As I mentioned earlier, we've seen several key milestones come out of the AEMC's rules consultation process. For example, the Enhancing Reserve Information and Improving Security Frameworks for the Energy Transition, we saw final determinations for each of those initiatives published in March. And with that, firm committed go-live dates to be factored into the roadmap, as you can see on the screen, and for those that have actually taken a look at the roadmap today. We, AEMO, are in the process of pulling together high-level implementation assessments for May and June, respectively, for those initiatives, which we'll cover off in more detail in the next section. But at a high level, just so those that aren't familiar with what that type of assessment is, what we're looking to do there is set out the changes required, be it to procedures or guidelines or market systems, applications or interfaces, the time required to make those changes, as well as what our plan is for when those changes will be made, or in the case of procedures and guidelines, when those changes will be consulted upon. I just noticed on our slide there, we do use the old acronym of HLID. We've recently changed our terminology for that assessment from high-level implementation design to high-level implementation assessment. So my apologies for any confusion that this may create as we go through the pack. Just jumping into the third row there, sorry, just going back one slide, my apologies, Anitra. I just wanted to call out the accelerating smart meter deployment rule change has been fast-tracked due to a draft determination stage, I should say, and that's really in recognition of the metering services review. That draft determination was published in April with a proposed scope and timeframe for implementation. It's worthwhile calling out that AEMO has since published and also hosted a webinar on its high-level implementation assessment, including proposing or recommending additional phases to the implementation for that initiative. That's been shared with the AMC and certainly communicated more broadly. But however, obviously the final timing for implementation of that initiative will be subject to the AMC's final determination. So this is something that we are monitoring and will continue to engage with through the rules consultation process and look to update in the roadmap accordingly. If we just jump to the next slide now, thanks. For the unlocking CR benefits rule change, unlocking CR benefits through flexible trading, I should say, the AMC published a draft rules determination in February of this year as well. Like the accelerating smart meter deployment, AEMO has since published and hosted a webinar on its high-level implementation assessment as part of what we are referring to, and Dave mentioned earlier, our informed go-live process. Dom's going to speak to this in a little bit more detail in the next section, but if I can steal maybe a little bit of Dom's thunder, essentially AEMO has recommended the implementation date for this work be pushed out from that featured in the draft determination. So that accounts for both our assessment, but also the feedback that we receive from stakeholders in relation to our high-level implementation assessment. So we've actually looked to reflect that in the roadmap at this point in time. For the integrating price responsive resources into the NEM, the previous iterations of the roadmap have always captured an indicative implementation timeline based on the scope as featured in the original rule change proposal, and that's because AEMO was the rule proponent in this case. Timing for key milestones associated with the rules consultation process, however, have been pushed out in accordance with the AEMC's update paper that was published in December. So as a result, this is an example where we've just simply looked to move the indicative implementation timeline in the roadmap to account for that change in the rules consultation process itself. This initiative is scheduled to go through our informed go live process, which, as I mentioned before, will be covered in the next section. And so I dare say, or a pretty good gut feel, that there will be further changes to the timelines as they're represented in the roadmap today following that process. I touched on earlier the various CER and DER initiatives and kind of what's our thinking in that space, and as well as the IDAM, IDEX, and MPC. I'll also touch on those three foundational and strategic initiatives when we walk through the section of the roadmap in a little bit's time. Next one, please. So my apologies. This slide is always really difficult to read, and my apologies for that. But I do think it's probably important that we do provide a snapshot of the roadmap for those wondering what it does look like if we've not actually been to the file before. We do encourage you to all access the real thing and take a look. And certainly we are always open to feedback on ways that we can improve it. If there's things that we've potentially missed that should be covered in there, certainly just reach out to the NEM reform program and we'll look to address any concerns or any feedback that you do have. If we jump to the next slide. Finally, in addition to the roadmap, we've also made updates to the various supporting artifacts that do get published alongside it. So these include the initiative briefs, program scope, and governance documents. Many on the call will likely be familiar with all of those. But for those that aren't, just quickly, they either provide an overview of the program itself or the governance arrangements that have been established around the program and that support it. But there are also 3-page, essentially short and brief summaries on each of the original post-2025 initiatives that are captured within the roadmap. This time around, in response to some of the feedback that we had received, both externally and internally, we've actually made quite a concerted effort to improve the overall readability of those initiative briefs. Really trying to provide those external and internal stakeholders with a better understanding of both the objective scope and some of the key assumptions underpinning the initiatives. And I think this is the major change, where information is available, inclusion of either the procedure and guideline changes, the application changes, the interface changes required for implementation of that initiative. Further, we've drawn on our high-level impact assessments, both across the market and industry stakeholders, as well as AEMO's own internal teams. And that really brings together some work that AEMO have done in terms of our own assessment, and as I mentioned earlier, feedback that we've received from participants through our various committees and forums established under the program. Like I said at the beginning of the last session, I will call out that this information is general in nature, so we do encourage stakeholders to make their own assessment as they review and understand the scope of any one individual initiative moving forward. So that was a quick kind of summary of the where we're at to with and what are some of the major changes that have occurred in the roadmap. Dave, happy to either take some questions or hand it back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Lance. I think we're going pretty well on time, so I think Dom, I'll hand to you to go through the inform go live, and I expect we'll have time for questions at the end, and certainly encourage participants on the call to throw questions in the chat if as they jump to mind. Over to you, Dom.
Awesome, thanks, Dave. If we move to the next slide, thanks, Anitra. And hi, everyone. My name's Dom. For those of you who haven't met me, I support the initiatives that within the NEM reform program that are in the early stages. And so this informed go live process, which is a new process we're sort of introducing into the program, I support our delivery of these. What we thought we would do is take you through what we were intending to achieve by the informed go live process. Recognizing it's a new process. We've now delivered 2 HLIAs, we're calling them now, as Lance mentioned earlier, and 2 industry sessions. So, wanted to describe what we were aiming to achieve, and hopefully get some discussion or feedback around whether it's useful and any improvements you might like to see. So the general process is for us, post the issuing of a draft determination by the AEMC, so that we have a scope that we can then work off, for AEMO to draft up what we think the business process, procedures, and system impacts of that scope are, do some high-level system design, and then provide some views as to what we think the implementation timeframe might be. So based on the scope, based on our assessment of how we would solution it, or how we think we'd solution it, and what we think the impacts are for procedures, as an example, we can then say, well, given that scope, how much time do we think we and industry need to support the implementation of that initiative? Now, of course, it's subject to the policy direction that's in the draft determination. Of course, that can change between draft and final, and it's subject to the scope that's in that draft determination as well. What we're trying to achieve is to give industry greater visibility of what our AMO's plans are from a solutioning perspective, and give you the opportunity to plan out your work and provide input into our plans quite early in the stage. Particularly in the context of a very crowded reform agenda over the next few years. We're looking at bundling opportunities, sequencing opportunities, and thinking about the interdependencies between initiatives. And so we want to get that information out to you as soon as we practically can, so that we can then get feedback. Finally, to support participants in making your submissions to the AEMC, by virtue of giving you a view as to the timeframes or our proposed timeframes and the solution that we're proposing to put forward, so that can inform your submissions to the AEMC. So in the timeline here, we've shown the timeline that we did for the Unlocking CER Benefits Through Flexible Trading Arrangements, HLIA, which is the first one that we did. Take this as sort of indicative. We did make some changes for the metering services review or accelerating smart meter deployment initiative. But broadly speaking, we receive a draft determination. We then look to essentially publish the HLIA and participant impact assessment and host an industry briefing prior to stakeholder submissions being due to the AEMC. So that's our ideal situation. That's what we're targeting to achieve. For this particular initiative, the flexible trading arrangements one, we weren't able, just due to timing, we weren't able to publish the HLIA prior to the stakeholder submissions. So what we did instead is host an industry session in order to try to give participants some view of our perspective before the submissions were due, and then we published it. I think the very day that submissions were due to the AEMC. For the metering service review, we were able to publish the HLIA earlier. And in fact, we published the HLIA like a week before we hosted the industry session. We then provide participants with the opportunity to give us feedback, formal feedback through a submissions process. Of course, we take feedback during the briefing session as well. And then we process that feedback, consider it, and we then, in this particular case, we revised our implementation plan accordingly. So we've pushed out our recommended implementation date from, it was previously May 2026, and we pushed it out to November 2026 based on the discussion that we had at the briefing session and formal feedback that we received. We haven't yet published it. It should come out by the end of this week or start of next week. We will publish version 0.2 of the HLIA to reflect that update. And then, of course, subsequent to that, we'd receive a final determination as per normal process. So if we just go to the next slide, please, Anitra. The content that we cover in the HLIA and participant impact assessment is, what the dates are that are proposed in the draft determination, a summary of the rule change and its impact to market systems, interactions between systems and participants, and the procedures that we think will need to be updated. It is a high level implementation assessment, so it is at the level of sort of high, medium, low, and we show it as a heat map across the different systems or procedures that are impacted. We then assess what we think the participant impacts are. So we look at different participant types and we provide a high, medium, low assessment to the extent known. And there's probably two call outs here. Firstly, it's based on the changes that we are making to our market systems. So there may be other B2B, for example, impacts on participants that are not driven by our changes to our market systems. There may be changes that participants may need to make to meet the rule change that don't impact our systems at all, that are completely independent within your back-end systems. We don't assess those at all because, quite frankly, we're not the right party to do that. So these impact assessments are really about how we see the changes we're making to our systems then and procedures impact you. Of course, each participant has their own special or specific circumstances and systems and other programs that are going on at the same time. So it's never going to be exact, but we provide a indicative view. We look at, based on the degree of change and risk and complexity and participants impacted, we have a think about what we think the industry test approach would be. For example, do we think that it would be sensible to have a longer or shorter test industry test window? Do we think that there's a separate environment, like a sandbox type environment that would be helpful, etc.? And we use all of this above information to then drive a delivery schedule, a high level implementation schedule. That schedule ultimately considers congestion and contention, so what other initiatives are doing. And so we end up with a combined implementation roadmap, if you like, that considers dependencies and sequencing and what have you from other initiatives that are in progress. Now, all of this is based on the information in the draft determination. The final determination may have a different scope or any other sort of forms of changes, but predominantly scope changes are of interest to us. If those scope changes occur, then of course the implementation timeframe, the system impacts, etc., may need some tweaking. And so once the final determination comes out, we will review our draft HLIA, make any changes, and then publish an updated version. So there's two examples of these that are coming out soon, improving security frameworks and enhanced reserve information. Both of those are in final determination, and we're looking to publish HLIAs in the coming few weeks. So it should be out in early June. So if we just go to the next slide, please. Look, this is taken from the Flexible Trading Initiative. And I suppose this is the level of detail that we are looking to provide to participants. So we're really focusing on the milestones that will impact you. So when will you receive issues papers? When will you receive tech specs? When will you receive industry test strategies, and when will the industry test windows start? So we're focused on publishing those dates so that you can then take this information and orchestrate, if you like, your own programs around these dates and understand, when the dates are that are going to impact you. So in conclusion, this is a new process. We've only done 2 of these HLIAs. I think it's fair to say that we've learnt a lot moving from the first one to the second one. And and we certainly would welcome any further feedback. We hope it's helpful to you as participants, that it is providing value. Some of the lessons learned, if you like, I would hope that people would agree. In the MSR industry session, we deliberately made a choice to try to publish the HLIA and the material a week before, in the hope that that would give participants the ability to read the material beforehand and come armed with questions, or more informed questions, because you've had the material for longer. We also tried to hold questions till sort of at the end of sections, and had the team be able to respond to questions in the chat. They're just two examples of things that we tried to improve, but we'll certainly be progressively aiming to improve the HLIAs as we go through more and more of these, and certainly happy to take industry feedback on anything we can do to make it more effective and helpful to you. I might pause there and hand back to you, David.
Great, thanks for that, Dom. Finally, on to the last section of today's session, I think walkthrough of the roadmap, and back to you, Lance.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Dave. So we figured we might as well take a bit of a walk through the roadmap. And if we think about if 2023 for all of us was quite busy, then 2024 only continues with that trend, with several major reforms set to go live over the calendar year, as you can see on the screen. Probably none more so than the Integrated Energy Security, IESS, I should say, Integrated Energy Storage Systems, with its final releases set for June, bringing a conclusion to that project that actually commenced back in 2021, following the AMC's final determination, or actually back to 2019 if you count from when the original rule change request went in. In addition to that, we know that there are a number of retail market improvements or amendments to AEMO's retail electricity market procedures to be implemented, including in relation to net system load profiles in September, and metering substitutions, which are scheduled for November. Work has also commenced on the Improving Security Frameworks initiative, with AEMO's current area of focus being on the development of a transitional security enablement procedure. We've got to have that done by the 30th of June of this year, and that sets out our minimum or recommended contract requirements. Further, AEMO has commenced its consultation on the PFR requirements to account for those changes that did arise out of the AEMC's clarifying mandatory PFR obligations for bidirectional plant rule change. Wow, that's a mouthful. These changes are considered to be minor or administrative in nature and are primarily required to ensure the PFR requirements is consistent with the rules. Finally, and one of the other big things, certainly not lastly, but is the commencement of the non-financial operation from December of the new frequency performance payment system for regulation FCAS, essentially replacing the existing cause of pay system. So we heard from Oliver in our last session a little bit further details on that one as well. If we just jump to the next slide, thank you. So my interpretation of the roadmap is that 2025 through to 2026 period will not only see an increase in the number of initiatives, but also the size and complexity of those initiatives to be delivered under the program. Now, we've got a few committed initiatives already, as you can see on the screen. So, for example, in June of 2025, we'll see the financial operation of the frequency performance payment system go live. That follows a 6-month period of non-financial operation. We've also got slated in that similar time period for July 2025, the go live for the ST Passa replacement project. So AEMO have done some work looking to re-baseline our assumptions around the timeline for that initiative. We went out to stakeholders on the 15th of April with a number of different options for that. We have received some feedback, and we are considering that feedback, and we'll certainly look to provide an update to stakeholders by the end of this month, I believe. For now, what we've got in the roadmap is the the current timeline with that July 2025 start. If there are any changes to that moving forward, we'll certainly look to amend that accordingly in future iterations of the roadmap. Finally, the other one big piece to call out here is the in December, we've got the operational enablement aspects of the Improving Security Frameworks initiative that are set to go live as well. This is where AEMO is empowered to effectively enable or schedule security services moving forward with that whole of NEM perspective moving forward. In addition to those that are committed, we will likely have seen final rules determination in relation to the accelerating smart meter deployment and unlocking benefits of CR through flexible trading rule changes, the former of which will certainly have aspects set to go live in 2025. The latter will certainly be looking to deliver aspects of it through 2025, but its go live dates are likely to be in 2026. I will touch on our foundational and strategic initiatives, which certainly make up a big part of this period. But it would be quite remiss of me not to call out that the fact that there's just ongoing regulatory and policy reform work that is continuing across many areas, including, for example, the transmission access reform market review that the AMC is running. Many of those aren't actually shown on this screen here, but will certainly require resources and input from industry and will require us to engage and monitor accordingly. So we will do absolutely that. And we will certainly reflect it in the roadmap once they move into a more detailed planning or even execution phase, depending on where they get to. So not only are we kind of conscious when it comes to the roadmap of the implementation aspects of any one initiative or the program as a whole, but really some of the upfront regulatory or policy work that is done in the lead up to a final determination as well. If we just jump to the next slide, thanks. And Dina, I might be able to answer your question a little bit. I know Megan's already touched on it in the chat, but we've included this slide for those who may not have seen it before, as it shows the indicative investment delivery timeframe for those AEMO foundational and strategic initiatives, IDAM, IDEX, and MPC. And we've pulled this out of our draft business case that was published earlier this year. I'm pleased to say that we received industry support for that draft business case at the exec forum established under the program on the 28th of March 2024. That being said, final business case and confirmed AEMO investment decision is expected in the coming weeks. So what we've got in the roadmap today is this indicative timeframe that's been replicated out of the business case. However, it's obviously subject to AEMO's final investment decision on these initiatives, but also further consultation with industry on the proposed timelines moving forward. So in reading the roadmap, I would absolutely anticipate that there will be changes to these initiatives and kind of how they're represented once we kind of get through that next hurdle being AEMO's final investment decision on the business case moving forward. Just moving on, please. So I think it's always important just to touch on some of the trends. So this will come as no surprise to many of you on the call. 2025-26 on the surface absolutely remains a congested delivery period, and that's despite some of the delays or changes in the status of various initiatives. We with the RDC did an initial assessment of that congested period back in November of 2023, and the outcomes from that was basically an acknowledgement that we need to continuously monitor that evolving reform landscape in conjunction with a bit of a renewed focus on ensuring that we're constantly identifying opportunities to optimize the delivery of the program. When it comes to this version of the roadmap, I think that those conclusions certainly remain the case. And this is because several releases or go live dates as set out within the roadmap across that period are still subject to ongoing rules or policy development processes. So a lot is yet to be committed, and until such time, they're obviously subject to change moving forward. As I mentioned earlier, in terms of other trends, we continue to see a growth in the program as new electricity or gas policy or rule changes have been proposed and are assessed. An example of that being the AMC's rule change on shortening the settlement cycle, as well as an extension of the timeframes for consideration of many of these processes. And I mentioned transmission access reform a few times today. That's a continuation of the ESB's congestion relief market priority access model work. So we've seen that in a number of spaces. So as a result, when it comes to the roadmap, it really does highlight not only the increase in scope, it certainly seems that we add more reforms to the program than what we can deliver at times. But we also have an increase in the timeframe for implementing those reforms moving forward, with many things shifting out to the right. Finally, similar trends to last time in terms of the amount of uncertainty that remains within the program as policies or various processes progress. This is something that we are continuously monitoring and engaging with, and certainly looking to update and amend as things do progress in time. That being said, those trends that trend in particular can create opportunities to better manage some of the implementation risks and challenges associated with delivering such a breadth of initiatives across the program. So we are constantly looking for ways to say bundle or sequence initiatives to make sure that we're delivering as cost effectively as possible. We certainly look to work with the RDC on identifying some of those opportunities, but we also welcome it to the wider cohort of stakeholders. If there are opportunities that you do see, do let us know. We are certainly open to hearing any ideas on how best we as a collective can deliver the program more broadly. And I'll just jump to the next slide, and I think this is the final slide for the day. So the remainder of this year, and no surprise, and leading into 2025 and 2026 will absolutely be busy and challenging for all, with several reforms to be delivered. We do hope that, particularly in the latter half of this year, we'll have a greater clarity in terms of a number of final rule determinations, or in the case of some of our most foundational and strategic initiatives, investment approval or not for those initiatives, which will help address some of the uncertainty around timing, scope, and really progression of those initiatives moving forward. Finally, and I'm sure everyone on the call is kind of feeling the pinch a little bit, from a deliverability and resourcing impacts, we are certainly monitoring all of that from our side of things, and do encourage you to do the same. AEMO will continue to work with the RDC to further assess any opportunities, as I've said before, to really drive that efficiency in implementation and leveraging processes such as the informal go live process that Dom has mentioned earlier, as ways that we can help smooth out the implementation of the reform program more broadly moving forward. So with that, I'll stop there and hand it back to you, Dave.
Great, thanks for that, Lance. And hopefully participants on the call found that useful. We've got time in this session to open up the floor to any questions. So I'd encourage participants to just raise their hands if they do have a question that they want to raise for the team on the roadmap, or any other queries throughout the entire day session, really, that we've covered. While people are taking a minute to think through any questions that they might have, I'll just pop in the chat feedback form link for anyone who has less than 30 seconds to just provide feedback on today's session. So opportunity there to provide questions, comments, and how you found today's two sessions. And that would be greatly appreciated for those who have a moment. I don't see any hands raised at the moment. And I think we have addressed most of the comments and queries in the chat. So I'll just pause for another minute to give people an opportunity to think through any questions they might have. Certainly, as is presented on screen, for anyone who might have questions or queries following today's session, the NEM reform at aemo.com.au mailbox is open for participants to submit any questions they might have. Additionally, the NEM reform program website and AEMO's section of the website and implementation roadmap are available at the links below. We did have a hand raised in the previous session. Was it Cam, maybe? Just wondering if he's still on the line. Not on the line. Sounds like not on the line. Great. Well, it doesn't look like we have any questions. Certainly do reach out. Oh, here we have Henry. Hi, Henry. Feel free to come off mute and
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity. And I noticed we've just got a little bit of time, and you actually probably covered it, under the one of the areas of concern, and I'm sure you are dealing with it. But however, the high-level implementation assessment, participant impact assessment, there's so much reform that's been thrown on the table, and you did mention, can we do it as a bundle, or is a better way to do it sequentially? And some of the reform processes are extremely complex, and when I've been in a number of forums when we've discussed access reforms, one, for example, I'll use that as an example. And I said, we're going to have a capacity investment scheme overlaying the current dispatch process. We could have transmission access reform overlaying the current processes. And over and above that, we talk about our normal dispatch processes, but we also got to take into account the directions and intervention can still occur. And that puts another layer. And the question then is, to what point can we go before we arrive at a situation, right on the boundaries where we get adverse outcomes that were probably not anticipated? Look, they're probably, let's say they're low probability, but the outcome is high impact, and might lead to market suspension because we can't operate in accordance with the rules as such. So my question there is, and I look, I haven't got the answer for you because I haven't got all the details of all the assessments, but if we look at to what extent can we advise the AMC and the ministers that sequential would be ideal, because then you really give the reform implementation and the operationalization of it a chance to work under a multitude of conditions. Got a high demand summer, a lot of generation out, transmission outages and the like. So I'm just wondering, are you approaching a point of concern where you say, well, look, we really got to slow down and prioritise the most important ones, but then your hands are tied because AMC has already set a date for you that you've got to achieve, you go live. Does that make sense what I'm saying? And
yeah, it does, Henry, and I'm happy to give a high level comment and then hand to the team to respond to that maybe in more detail. I think you're absolutely right. This is a concern. Congestion is something that's on our industry risk register that we maintain on the website. It's something we've discussed at the PCF. We are bound, like you said, by the AMC rule dates, and our efforts to manage that are maintaining that open conversation with the AMC and using the method of the high level implementation at a high level impact assessment to provide that informed go live to the AMC to show what the impact of these particular reforms may be on and provide realistic timeframes against some of those items. I think, to speak to the roadmap, and Lance or Dom might speak in more detail, we look then for opportunities where we can bundle and sequence against the timelines that we've kind of got. So we're looking for those opportunities and working within the scope that we've been given in terms of implementation dates. So look, it's definitely a risk on the radar. It's one we're trying to manage using a variety of methods. HLIA is one, and something we've been keeping a watching brief on. But I'll throw to Dom or Lance if you have any additional comments, or any of the AEMO SMEs.
Thanks, Dave. I suppose I'd add, it's a good question, Henry. I suppose I'd add, in the HLIA and in the implementation timeframes that we're putting together, we're actively pursuing opportunities to get that sequential thinking that you're referring to. So as an example, for the metering services review, HLIA, that we just published, we deliberately sort of scheduled our procedure consultation so that we would focus on one area of consultation before moving on to the next area, which was, in this case, was power quality data. So we're trying to avoid situations where the same type of resources or the same group of people are looking at sort of a multitude of activities simultaneously that we don't think would be achievable. The second point I'd make is that we've deliberately pushed for a twice yearly release strategy. And I think that's a pretty significant outcome when you think about the sort of congestion and the ability for us to manage some of these changes. And you know, that's been a deliberate point where we've said, okay, well, theoretically, in an unconstrained view, we could potentially have a go live in March, as an example. But we'll say, no, we wouldn't do that. We push it to the mid-year go live in order to, you know, to ensure that we can sort of bundle those releases and have a sort of sequential, structured release strategy. I think if we were to get to a point where we were assessing an initiative and we thought, look, just given everything else that's going on and the nature of this initiative, it just could not be done in this time frame because of the other initiatives that were going on, we would look to push, you know, to recommend to push that initiative out. And certainly some of the HLIA assessments that we've done already have taken into consideration the other work that's going on. So, for example, MSR, we considered the IDEX work that was occurring simultaneously. And certainly we welcome feedback into the HLIA process as well. If you believe that our timeframe, you know, it would be achievable if there was nothing else going on, but because of everything else that's going on, it should be extended, then we would certainly welcome that sort of feedback.
That's an interesting challenge, and I'll take it on board. But and that's very comforting what you've said, that discipline is being deployed and employed by you. I suppose in addition to that, I would say if there's nothing indicating that there's a threat but emerges once you've actually gone live, are you in any circumstances preparing well, we've got to pull that out, but it might lead to market suspension. I recognise that, because if you remove a component of a go live that's part of the dispatch process, then you arguably can't dispatch in accordance with the rules. And that's an extreme case, but I'm just wondering how prepared you might be in the event nothing was picked up in, you know, in your HLIAs, PIAs, went in smoothly, then all of a sudden we've seen an adverse interaction occurring. How would you pull? I'm just throwing that on the table, and you can't sort of do it for everything, but probably you need to prioritise the highest impact ones that could undermine the integrity of the market. I'm just throwing it on the table. I you know, if I could predict those, I'd go into that $150 million Powerball, predict the numbers. I reckon I could probably do that easier than predicting the outcomes that I'm talking about. But anyway, I'm just putting it on the table that it's getting more complex, and the likelihood of something like that happens is probably increasing, but still nevertheless probably in the low probability area. But by gee, when it does hit, that I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Henry. Yeah, and I guess it just maybe a point on these HLIAs and PIAs that they are quite high level at this stage in the process. And so as we work through the deployment, there is certainly a very detailed register of checks and balances before any major changes get implemented.
Thank you. No, I appreciate it.
Thanks, Henry. Any other questions? Comment in the chat. I can't see who it's from, but just noting, I guess the rate at which things are being deployed, which is fast paced. Great. Well, I guess we're almost at time. We can give 2 minutes back to all on the call. Thank you very much for your participation in today's sessions. As I mentioned earlier, feedback certainly greatly appreciated, and look forward to engaging with you as we work through the deployment of all of these reforms. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.